What if I told you that for much of our federal government, there are ethics rules in place for members of Congress, for executive members, but not always for judges? Recently, there's been news about donations or trips taken by justices from wealthy donors that have raised the question of judicial ethics and what kind of reforms might be necessary. So what are the rules they play by? What are the proposed changes? Dr. Adam Carrington of Hillsdale College joins us to break down those questions and more. That's all coming up right here, right now. I'm Sam Chen, and this is Face the Issues. Good evening and welcome to Face the Issues. I'm Sam Chen. For much of the federal government and many state and local governments, there are ethics rules that govern what members of Congress or executive branch members are allowed to accept as far as gifts go and so forth. But this isn't always the case with our judges. And recent news has revealed that a number of judges, Supreme Court justices, have either received gifts or taken trips that are donated by wealthy donors. And this has raised the question of what kind of ethics and rules do our judges play by, and perhaps what rules should they play by. Of course, nothing in our judiciary happens without being politicized, and hence the conversation of what ethics and reforms are necessary becomes imperative. We're joined by no one better to discuss this with Dr. Adam Carrington, the Associate Professor of Politics at Hillsdale College and the William and Patricia LaMothe Chair in the U.S. Constitution. Dr. Carrington, welcome back to Face the Issues.
Glad to be back with you. Thanks for having me.
It is always a pleasure to have you, Adam. And let's just jump right into this. Spring of 2023, news broke that Justice Clarence Thomas, one of the associate justices on the court, had been accepting gifts, vacations, and so forth from Harlan Crow, who's a well-known billionaire GOP donor. Certainly, Justice Thomas is not the only justice ever to accept such things. This is just the most recent and perhaps the justice about which the most noise was made in the spring of 2023. But this does kind of lead us to this question of judicial ethics and potentially judicial reform. At face value, this looks bad, right? Is it actually bad? What should we make of it as a public?
I think that there's two things to consider. First is whether we think there was actual impropriety, or you could say unethical activity here. And the main thing that people are worried about is, why would you want to know the information that's been coming out about the justices, including Justice Thomas? It's to ask whether they're doing their job properly. Are they properly applying the law, or are they taking bribes, or are they being directed in a certain way based on their relationships that might make them see the person and not the case or the law, and therefore be biased in a way that undermines our very concept of the rule of law. I mean, this all goes back to biblical times. If you look at the way the Old Testament of the Christian and the Hebrew Bible talk about judging, it's all about not taking bribes, not being partial to poor persons, whether rich or poor, friend or enemy. But the second thing to keep in mind here that I think is because I don't think we've seen any smoking guns that's been happening as far as bribes or partiality or anything like that in cases. But the worry is that it took a lot of effort, and it was not and there was no regularized process to know that these kind of interactions had happened. And so what if there was a situation where something truly undermining to the judicial branch's impartiality and the judicial power had happened? We don't seem to have a process for smoking out those things and having a clear rules for when those things need to be reported, so we could know if something really bad was happening.
Adam, there are ethics rules for members of the legislative branch and their staffs, members of the executive branch and their staffs. That's probably something that most viewers are unaware of. I formerly am a staff member of both the U.S. House and Senate, and we had to sign agreements to ethics rules about the amount of gifts that we could receive. There's a price limit on the gifts that we receive. There's a disclosure that we will not lobby for a year after leaving office. We won't lobby our offices and so forth. There's all these different regulations for legislative and executive branches. And in some states and counties across the country, there are judicial rules that judges have to report, for example, campaign contributions if it's a state where you run for your judge seat, or they have to report the gifts that they receive. Are there any regulations right now or ethics rules or processes for the federal judiciary?
There are. There is a code of conduct for United States judges, and it's actually based off the American Bar Association's Code of Judicial Conduct. There are some basic statutes that apply to all federal officials, but the difference here is those rules are not nearly as inclusive. They're not nearly as broad, or you could, I guess, say comprehensive, as those that have been set within the House and the Senate for their members and their staffs. Within all of the executive branch, there's even a oversight department that looks at ethical issues. That's basically its job for the executive branch. And so you don't have those same level of rules that are covered in the judicial branch. So it's not as if bribery is legal. There have been judges that have been impeached at the lower court level. There have been judges that have been tried and convicted of crimes. But these sort of questions, like what's been coming out with Justice Thomas and others, those are the kind of things that are absolutely covered by the particular codes of conducts of other branches and are not for the Supreme Court. So the blatantly, easily illegal things, yes, those are covered. But these sort of, what you would say, the level of being that extra step of above reproach, where there's a lot of a revealing of what one's doing so that you can not even have the appearance of impropriety, that's the level that seems to be missing from the judicial that is there for the others.
So what we're not seeing is a situation where, say, somebody comes to a judge and says, here is a sum of money, or here is a college admission for your child. I need you to throw this case my way. But there is a concern that if somebody, let's say, annually contributes an amount to a judge or helps their family or sends them on vacation, and then that donor ends up before the court, that the judge has rule of law issues. The judge no longer has reason free from all passion, as John Locke would say. Is that the concern, that it's not necessarily a immediate quid pro quo, but in the long run, there is a possibility here for judges to become biased or potentially to be bribed?
Yes, and I think also it would then give the public some assessment of whether then a judge in a certain case should recuse himself. So Justice Thomas, for example, recused himself in a case involving the Virginia Military Institute in the 90s. Why? His son was attending VMI at the time. And so the idea was that would be a clear violation. Just this last term, the new Justice of the Supreme Court, Justice Jackson, recused herself from the Harvard affirmative action case because she had served at Harvard University for part of the time where the litigation issues coming before the court had arisen. So yes, I think the worry here is that over time there could be relationships that build up a conflict of interest, and sometimes even unintentionally. This is not necessarily something that would happen in a kind of calculated way, although there are people that have calculated intents in trying to get access to Supreme Court justices. So I think the standard here is there just needs to be a lot of openness, because if you go back to the American founders, they knew money was a very powerful tool. It could be a very powerful tool for good if you spend public money for the public good, but it could be used nefariously, including for trying to buy power and influence. And the main point here is, first, just having rules so that we know who's getting money where, what, who's getting maybe special perks where and what. Just realizing that I think in some ways It's not even that we're necessarily sure that a Supreme Court justice is going to cheat or be unethical or be biased. It's that we also want the public to have the assurance that they're not missing something. So it's both a objective thing, making sure that nothing really is happening, but it's also a subjective thing. We live in a time where people are really distrustful of institutions. There's a deep lack of trust in them, a deep lack of faith in them. How do we restore that? I think a lot of transparency is the beginning point.
And you answered my next question, which is if we see these justices recusing themselves, as Thomas did with the VMI case, as Jackson Brown did with the Harvard case, is there even a reason for us to be worried about the bribe? To your point, it's not just the internal, the external perception matters as well. And certainly transparency is a good answer for all of these things. But Adam, let me ask you this. There is reason to believe that a lot of these issues are being raised because of polarization and for political causes. I mean, there's no secret that the political left in America has not been excessively happy with some recent Supreme Court decisions. Not all. I mean, there are many that the conservative side are upset with. And there does seem to be a suggestion with a lot of the proposed reforms, whether it's judicial ethics or packing the court, that this is done to achieve certain decisions at the court. What do we make of that argument, and does that apply to the overarching question of should we have ethics reform?
I think that Federalist 1, that was written by Alexander Hamilton, is helpful in this. He talks about separating out good or bad motives from good or bad policies or good or bad suggestions. And I think it is absolutely true that it's no coincidence that as the court has taken a originalist or textualist direction, which is more often affiliated with the political right in today's politics, that the political left, or elements of it, I don't want to paint too broad a stroke, have all of a sudden discovered the need to take a harder look at the ethical dealings of Supreme Court justices, and especially certain Supreme Court justices that happen to have a certain ideology. I think that's absolutely true. I think there is a partisan bias to this. There's a partisan motive. There is an attempt to discredit the court because certain people don't like the opinions and decisions of the last couple years. But I think that if you want to, you got to be careful in just dismissing that, because sometimes even when there are bad motives, and I think there are some in this instance, that doesn't mean it doesn't end up having a decent suggestion or a decent reform. And I think what you do is you separate out the intent, and you separate out the what some are trying to do with, is there actually a decent way of doing this? Is there actually some good that could achieve not a partisan goal, but overall more accountability and a more ethical government? And I think that's something you can do here, is to sort of, to use a biblical reference again, separate out the wheat from the chaff as far as the policy proposals.
And certainly a very judicious way of doing it, right? I mean, this is the idea of a concurring opinion, that we might disagree on why we're doing it, but we're going to agree in the end that this is the right decision. And certainly something that would apply in this case as well. Adam, thank you for that summary. We're going to cut the break. When we come back, I want to ask you about the reforms that are being proposed and what you believe we should be doing with our justices and with judicial ethics. So don't go away. We'll be right back.
Face the Issues is produced and recorded in the studios of Lighthouse TV. Positively different. Watch Lighthouse TV wherever you go. Available on Roku, Amazon Fire TV, and Apple TV. You can view our in-house studio productions on demand, or watch what's on the station right now with our 24/7 live stream. Search Lighthouse TV online on your streaming device, or go to our website for more information. Visit lighthousetv.org to stay connected. There you can find out what's currently on the air and coming up, how to watch in your area on cable, satellite, broadcast, or streaming devices. Watch past programs or our live stream. Follow us on social media and learn more about the station, our hosts, and our programming. Lighthouse TV, positively different.
Welcome back to Face the Issues. My guest again is Dr. Adam Carrington of Hillsdale College. Adam, I want to talk to you a little bit about some of these proposed changes that are currently being debated in the United States Congress. Among the proposed plans right now from the Democrats in the Senate, one of them is adopting a code of conduct for justices and establishing procedures to receive and investigate complaints of judicial misconduct. There is a concern from the right here that we're going to just end up with complaint after complaint after complaint. It's going to be very politicized. Is there any merit to this idea that we establish a code of conduct and procedures for how we deal with these complaints?
I think that broad proposal on both sides, having an actual code itself and then having means of enforcing that code and investigating possible violations of that code, is perfectly reasonable. That's what goes on in the other departments as well. And you would have to actually show that the Judicial Department was somehow distinct when it comes to its ethical burden and its ethical oversight to say otherwise. I think that it's more a question of having clear rules, having oversight that is done in a way that itself is transparent, so that it doesn't become a way of, as you said, going after justices and miring them and investigation after investigation. And I think something that we should just take from this is looking at how this has been handled and developed in the other departments. Mm-hmm. It doesn't mean it's going to be one-to-one crossing the other, crossing the branches, but it doesn't seem that these ethical things have bogged down too much the legislative and executive branches, so we could learn from them as well. And I will say, I mean, even the Supreme Court itself is showing some interest in this. Just recently, Justice Kavanaugh, giving a talk in Cleveland before lawyers and judges, said that there is some real movement internally from the Supreme Court itself in trying to have some kind of code of ethics that could be done. And yes, I think we could talk about who should enforce that, who should investigate it. But you quoted Locke before. John Locke, the English thinker, says, there are no laws if there's no means of investigating their violation and enforcing them. So you would have to have with the code of conduct also some way of just keeping everyone honest to the standards.
Yeah. And speaking of John Locke, if somebody's going to call the station and complain about this, I am fully aware, as I'm sure you are, that Elle Woods and Legally Blonde also said that rule of law is reason free from all passion, but it obviously does not originate with Legally Blonde. So just to clarify that for those who are confused. Adam, one of the things, to your point, one of the things that they are taking from what the legislative and executive branch has done is the idea of financial reporting. Looking at adopting rules that would govern the disclosure of gifts, travel, income received by the justices and the law clerks. That would be similar to staffers in the Hill or staffers in the executive branch having to do this. And making sure they are at least as rigorous as the congressional disclosure rules, and also establishing procedural rules that would require each party or amicus before the court to disclose any gift, income, or reimbursement that's been provided to or from the justices. Again, this seems straightforward. Is this something that is good? Is this something that that there's concern about? And do you see this as something that would happen?
Yeah, I mean, one could possibly debate if you get into the particular bills that have passed the Senate, for example, for this. And Justice Alito asked whether the Congress would be the ones to do this versus the court doing it to itself. But the basics of knowing where gifts and money of at least a certain amount. I don't know that every time someone shares a stick of gum with the Supreme Court justice, it needs to get reported. But even these rules are giving certain levels. And I think the starting point really does need to be transparency, which is less a regulation of what you can do, but just a requirement that when you do it, you make it known to the public. And I know some of the justices are very reticent because they're very much, they want to guard their own privacy, the private lives. But and to some degree that should be respected. But when you accept a public office that is basically for life, there does come a change in what can be expected of the parts of your life that should be known and not known. And I think as far as anything that could legitimately touch on whether you're doing your job as the Constitution demands, as the rule of law demands, those are all game for a legitimate and reasonable code of ethics.
Yeah, there certainly is a balance, right, between protecting one's privacy. We saw this after the Dobbs decision and the threats that justices took, even to some extent after the famous eminent domain decision with New London and the calls to reclaim Justice Souter's properties. There is a balance between that level of privacy and also being held accountable that I think, to your point, is probably where we're walking this line and trying to really thread the needle. Adam, the last piece of the current proposal is that it would, right now this is done voluntarily, but it would require recusal from cases where there is a conflict of interest. Again, they want to expand the circumstances under which a justice or a federal judge might be disqualified and require the Supreme Court and the Judicial Conference to establish procedural rules. Again, putting this in the court's court, if you will, that wouldn't be Congress establishing the rules, but the Supreme Court would establish the rules for prohibiting the filing or striking of an amicus brief that would result in disqualification of a justice, judge, or magistrate judge. This, again, we've seen the court recuse themselves. We've seen a number of justices do this. Is this something that needs to be written into practice, or can we trust them to keep doing this?
This would be one that I would hold off on for now if I was advising. And I would say if it was done, I think this would especially need to be done by the court, because you don't want Congress gaming, even having the appearance of gaming who is actually sitting on a case to try to therefore get the result they want by how they write the rules. So I think it would need to be this would especially need to be judicially self-imposed. But where I would start is to have the disclosure rules and have maybe even some rules for what can and can't be done as far as accepting gifts or perks. Maybe you could even make restrictions on what can be done there. And I would then see if the justices, how well they follow this. So maybe if down the road these other reforms of disclosure or even rules about what can and can't be done ethically result in the justices not recusing themselves when it seems pretty obvious that they should, then I think you could step in and add rules or have the justices add rules that make recusing more official, more streamlined, more clear-cut. But we have such a long-standing history of doing it where the justices hold themselves to this that I would be reticent to jump right to that conclusion or jump right to that solution.
And to your point, Adam, it's not as if we haven't seen the justices do it in recent times. Just this year, we've seen justices do this. So this is not something that is something of the past that we no longer see. Adam, last question of this segment. Is there anything you believe that they're missing that you think we should either put forth as judicial ethics reform, or that judges should hold themselves to this kind of standard?
I think the basic disclosure rules especially make sense. If anything, I would just reiterate my own conclusion from what we just said, that it shouldn't extend, more how far it shouldn't extend, which is I don't think yet to making hard rules for when recusal should happen. But I think also that this should be a bit of a gradual approach. Let's put some rules in place. Let's air out the what's not been necessarily made known to the public. And then let's see where we are as far as what we find and if we need to go any further and how the public responds to it, and see if this is moving us in the direction of better and higher trust in this branch of the government.
Yeah. Great advice. Adam, don't go away. We'll be right back.
Watch Lighthouse TV wherever you go. Available on Roku, Amazon Fire TV, and Apple TV. You can view our in-house studio productions on demand, or watch what's on the station right now with our 24/7 live stream. Search Lighthouse TV online on your streaming device, or go to our website for more information. Visit lighthousetv.org to stay connected. There you can find out what's currently on the air and coming up, how to watch in your area on cable, satellite, broadcast, or streaming devices. Watch past programs or our live stream. Follow us on social media and learn more about the station, our hosts, and our programming. Lighthouse TV, positively different.
Welcome back to Face the Issues. Adam, thank you again for joining us. As you know, we like to close out all of our segments getting to know, or all of our shows getting to know our guests a little bit better. One of the things you and I talk a lot about is baseball and your Cincinnati Reds, who, by the way, have actually looked better than when we first started having you on the show. But probably the hottest tick in Cincinnati right now are the Bengals in the Joey Burrow era. You're a big Bengals fan. NFL season's just getting started. What are your hopes for your Bengals?
I never thought I would be saying this except for the last couple of years, but I think the hope is, can we get over the hump and win it all? And for context of that, until their Super Bowl run 2 years ago, the Bengals had not won a playoff game since I was 5 years old. And I'm not that young. So I think, though, that Joe Burrow is special. I haven't seen a Bengals quarterback like him since maybe Boomer Esiason. Well, certainly since him, but probably even before that. And so, yeah, we've got high hopes in Cincinnati. If everyone can stay reasonably healthy, that if we can get through Kansas City, since that seems to be our big back and forth now, I'm very hopeful that maybe we could win it all.
Yeah, the Patrick Mahomes in Kansas City does seem to be the roadblock for many, many teams. But I certainly know how you feel. I'm a Detroit Lions fan, and so my Lions actually start off the season defeating Patrick Mahomes and the Chiefs. But it's been a long drought.
Can I give? I do have a Detroit Lions connection, not just living in Michigan, but before the Detroit Lions went to Detroit, they were the Portsmouth Spartans, a little city in Ohio called Portsmouth, Ohio, which is basically right by where I grew up. So I've always had a soft spot for the Lions because of that old history.
And Portsmouth's not one of these sprawling metropolises like Cleveland or Cincinnati or Kansas City. That's a smaller. I mean, it's not tiny, but it's a smaller city in Ohio.
This was late 20s and early 30s when that happened. They left in 34 for Detroit, and it's much smaller now than it was then, but we always have a soft spot in our hearts for the what used to be the Portsmouth Spartans. So if they're not playing the Bengals, I'm pulling for them as well.
Well, hey, Lions fans, we will take all the bandwagon fans we can get, so we appreciate that. Adam Carrington, constitutional legal scholar and NFL historian, as we found out today. Thank you, Adam, as always, for joining us. It's always a pleasure.
Pleasure here as well. Thank you.
Yeah. That is our show for this evening. I want to thank Dr. Adam Carrington for joining us. And, of course, we want to thank each of you for tuning in as well. And we hope to see you again right back here next week. My name is Sam Chen. On behalf of all of us here at Face the Issues, thank you and good night.